In the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, 1884, where silver veins ran deeper than hope and winter winds cut sharper than a miner's pickaxe, some stories began with the sound of a baby's cry echoing through canyon walls like a prayer for mercy. This is one of those stories, about a man broken by loss, an infant fighting for life, and a woman whose compassion would transform them all. Thomas Mitchell had been many things in his 28 years: Union soldier, silver miner, devoted husband. But as he climbed the steep, rocky path to Silverbrook's schoolhouse, with baby Emma crying weakly against his chest, he was simply a man drowning in grief and responsibility he'd never asked for and couldn't handle alone. His wife Margaret's dying words haunted every sleepless night. "Promise me you'll keep her safe. Promise me she'll know she was loved." Now 5 days without proper milk and watching his 2-month-old daughter grow weaker by the hour, Thomas faced the terrifying reality that love might not be enough to keep his promise. Silverbrook clung to the mountainside like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by an avalanche. A rough mining town where silver dust coated everything and trust was as rare as a played-out claim. Here among the desperate miners and hardened merchants, where a man's worth was measured in ore and luck, the last thing anyone expected was salvation wearing a schoolteacher's dress. But sometimes mercy came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of 3 lives forever. And sometimes when all hope seemed lost, love found a way to bloom even in the harshest soil. The morning sun painted Silverbrook's weathered buildings in shades of gold and shadow. But Thomas Mitchell saw none of the mountain town's rugged beauty. His world had narrowed to the weight of his dying daughter in his arms, and the impossible task of finding help in a community that had already turned him away more times than he could count. Baby Emma's cries had become Thomas's heartbeat, constant, desperate, cutting through his soul with every ragged breath. 5 days of trying everything he could think of had left both father and daughter hollow and trembling. Emma's tiny lips were cracked and dry, her face flushed with fever, and Thomas knew with the certainty that came from watching too many things die in the mines that time was running out. The general store owner had claimed he had no milk, though Thomas had seen canned goods on the shelves. The saloon girls had laughed at his desperation, suggesting he try the next town over. Even Doc Peterson had shaken his head regretfully, saying there was nothing he could do without a wet nurse, and there wasn't one to be found for 50 miles in any direction. "Might try asking the school teacher," Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house had whispered when Thomas stopped by that morning, his desperation so obvious it made her uncomfortable. "Sarah Campbell. She lost her own baby not 6 months ago. Might still be able to help, though folks would talk something fierce if they knew." The words had hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd heard about the school teacher's loss, how her infant son had died of fever during the harsh winter, how she'd retreated into her work afterward, throwing herself into educating Silverbrook's children with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The schoolhouse sat at the end of Main Street, a tidy white building that looked out of place among the rough-hewn saloons and mining offices. It was the only structure in town with actual glass windows and a coat of paint that wasn't peeling, testament to the community's grudging respect for education, even if they didn't always understand its value. Thomas could hear children's voices reciting their lessons as he approached, the sound of normal life achingly beautiful in his world of crisis and despair. Through the windows, he could see neat rows of wooden desks and a blackboard covered with arithmetic problems. It was civilization in a place that often felt barely removed from the wilderness. He waited outside until the children filed out for their afternoon recess, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to Emma's weak whimpers. Boys in patched overalls and girls in faded calico dresses ran off to play, their voices echoing off the surrounding mountains. When the last student had disappeared around the corner, Thomas approached the schoolhouse door on unsteady legs, knowing this was his final chance. Sarah Campbell stood at the blackboard, erasing the day's arithmetic lesson with slow, methodical strokes. She was 26, with chestnut hair pinned back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that held both strength and a deep sadness that spoke of recent loss. Her dress was simple but well made, marking her as one of the few educated women in Silverbrook, someone who commanded respect even in this rough mining town. When Thomas knocked, she turned with the patient smile she reserved for worried parents. But the expression changed to immediate concern when she saw the desperate man holding a crying baby. She took in his appearance quickly, the several days' growth of beard, the clothes that hadn't been changed recently, the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from every line of his body. "Please," Thomas said before she could speak, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights and constant worry. "My daughter, she's dying. I've tried everything. Mrs. Patterson said that you could." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't ask this respectable woman to do something that would scandalize the entire town. Sarah's eyes went immediately to the baby, taking in Emma's flushed face and increasingly weak cries. Professional concern warred with personal pain on her features, and Thomas could see her remembering her own loss, feeling the echo of her own grief in his desperation. "How long since she's eaten?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but urgent, already moving toward him. 5 days, maybe longer. Her mother died in childbirth back in Denver. I've been trying to get her somewhere safe, but..." Thomas's voice broke slightly. "I don't know what else to do." Sarah stepped back, opening the door wider without hesitation. "Bring her inside." The schoolhouse interior was a sanctuary of order and learning. Books lined the walls, children's artwork decorated the windows, and a warm fire crackled in the pot-bellied stove. Sarah had created a haven of civilization in this rough mining town, and Thomas felt like an intruder bringing his desperation into her peaceful world. "Sit here," Sarah said, indicating a chair near the stove. Her movements were quick and efficient, but Thomas could see the slight tremor in her hands as she approached them, the way she seemed to steel herself for what she was about to do. "I lost my son 6 months ago," she said quietly, not quite meeting Thomas's eyes. "Fever took him when he was 4 months old. That is, I might still be able to help." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with shared grief and desperate hope. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes at the kindness of this woman who would risk her reputation and relive her own pain to save his daughter. "I can't ask you to do that," he said, though every fiber of his being wanted to accept her offer. "People would talk. It would ruin your reputation." Sarah looked down at Emma, whose cries had weakened to barely audible whimpers. The baby's tiny fist was pressed against her mouth, and her eyes had begun to lose focus in a way that terrified Thomas. "Let them talk," Sarah said firmly, reaching for the baby. "This child needs help, and I can provide it. Nothing else matters." As Sarah cradled Emma against her chest, Thomas saw something shift in her expression. The careful control she'd maintained since her own loss cracked slightly, revealing the deep well of maternal love that had been left with nowhere to go. "What's her name?" Sarah asked softly, beginning to unbutton her dress with practiced efficiency. Emma Rose Mitchell." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "Her mother chose the name before she died." "Hello, Emma Rose," Sarah whispered to the baby. "You're safe now." The moment Sarah guided Emma to her breast, the change was immediate and miraculous. The baby latched instinctively, desperately, her tiny hands kneading against Sarah's skin as she finally received the nourishment she'd been crying for. The sound that followed, soft suckling mixed with contented sighs, hit Thomas like a physical blow. He turned away, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Relief, gratitude, grief for Margaret, and something else. A recognition that this stranger was saving not just Emma's life, but his sanity and soul as well. "She's strong," Sarah said after a few minutes, her voice filled with wonder. "Listen to that determined little sound. She's going to be just fine." Thomas looked back to see Sarah gazing down at Emma with an expression of pure tenderness. The baby had fallen asleep at her breast, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time in days. The sight of his daughter finally at peace, finally safe, broke something loose in Thomas's chest. "Thank you," he whispered, the words completely inadequate for what she'd given them. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment Thomas saw past the controlled exterior to the woman beneath. Someone who had suffered loss as devastating as his own, who understood the desperate love of a parent trying to protect their child. "You don't need to repay anything," she said gently. This is what people do for each other. What they should do anyway. As the afternoon wore on and Emma slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, Thomas found himself studying the woman who had become his daughter's savior. There was a strength in Sarah Campbell that went beyond her education or her position in the community. It was the kind of strength that came from surviving the unthinkable and choosing to remain kind despite the cost. You can bring her back tomorrow, Sarah said when Emma began to stir again. And the next day, until she's strong enough for regular feeding, I have milk enough and… She paused, color rising in her cheeks. It feels good to be needed again. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. In saving Emma, Sarah was also saving something in herself, the part of her that had died with her son, the maternal love that had been left homeless and aching. As he prepared to leave with a now peaceful Emma in his arms, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Hope, not just for Emma's survival, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the three of them might find a way to heal each other's wounds. He didn't know yet that Silverbrook was about to become very interested in the arrangement between the desperate miner and the educated schoolteacher. He didn't know that kindness sometimes came with a price that had to be paid in gossip and judgment. But for now, walking back down Main Street with Emma sleeping soundly against his chest, Thomas Mitchell dared to believe that his daughter would live to see another sunrise. And for a man who had been drowning in despair just hours before, that was miracle enough. By the next morning, word of Thomas Mitchell's visit to the schoolhouse had spread through Silverbrook like wildfire through dry timber. In a town where privacy was as scarce as level ground and everyone's business became everyone else's entertainment, the sight of a desperate miner carrying a baby to the educated schoolteacher's door was too juicy a morsel of gossip to ignore. Thomas discovered this harsh reality when he stopped at Murphy's General Store for supplies before his second visit to Sarah. The conversations that had been buzzing around the pot-bellied stove died the moment he walked through the door, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that spoke louder than words. "Morning, Murphy," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady as he approached the counter. Emma was sleeping peacefully against his chest, a stark contrast to her desperate state the day before. "Mitchell," Murphy replied curtly, his usually friendly demeanor noticeably cooler. Behind him, Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Kowalski exchanged meaningful looks that made Thomas's stomach clench with dread. "Need some coffee and sugar," Thomas continued, pretending not to notice the tension. "And maybe some of that cornmeal if you got it." Murphy gathered the items without his usual chatter about the weather or the mines. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Mrs. Brennan finally spoke up, her voice dripping with false concern. "How's that baby doing, Thomas? Heard she was poorly yesterday." "She's much better, thank you for asking," Thomas replied carefully, sensing the trap being laid. "That's good to hear," Mrs. Kowalski chimed in, her tone suggesting it wasn't good at all. "Course, we all heard about your visit to Miss Campbell, such an unusual arrangement." Thomas felt heat rise in his neck. "Miss Campbell was kind enough to help when Emma needed it. I'm grateful for her Christian charity." "Christian charity," Mrs. Brennan repeated, rolling the words around like they tasted sour. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. These women, the supposedly respectable members of the community, were suggesting something improper about Sarah's act of mercy. The injustice of it, the sheer cruelty of turning a life-saving kindness into something sordid, made his hands clench into fists. "I'd be careful how you speak about Miss Campbell," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She saved my daughter's life when no one else would help." Now, Murphy intervened quickly, sensing the potential for violence. "No need for harsh words. We're all just concerned about propriety is all. Miss Campbell's got a reputation to maintain." "Her reputation is spotless," Thomas snapped. "She's the finest woman in this town, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." He threw coins on the counter and left without waiting for his change, Emma's soft breathing against his neck the only thing keeping him from saying something he'd regret. But as he walked toward the schoolhouse, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his acceptance of Sarah's help had somehow put her in danger. Not physical danger, but the kind of social destruction that could ruin a woman's life in a place like Silverbrook. Sarah was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when he arrived, her movements brisk and efficient despite the early hour. She looked up at his approach, and Thomas could see in her eyes that she'd already heard the talk. "Good morning, Thomas," she said with forced brightness. "How did Emma sleep?" "Like an angel, thanks to you." Thomas studied her face, noting the tight lines around her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "Sarah, about what people are saying, let them say what they will," she interrupted, but Thomas could hear the strain in her voice. "Come inside. Emma must be getting hungry." The interior of the schoolhouse felt different this morning, charged with intention that hadn't existed the day before. Sarah moved with the same efficiency, but Thomas could see the effort it took to maintain her composure. When she settled into the rocking chair and reached for Emma, her hands trembled slightly. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said quietly as Emma began to nurse. "I know it's causing you trouble." Sarah looked down at the baby, her expression softening despite her obvious stress. "Look at her, Thomas. Look how strong and healthy she is today compared to yesterday. How could I turn my back on that? Because people are talking. Because they're making it sound like something it's not. And what exactly are they saying?" Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but Thomas could hear the hurt underneath. Thomas hesitated, not wanting to repeat the ugly implications he'd heard at the store. "They're suggesting impropriety between us, as if there's something wrong with a woman showing Christian kindness to a child in need." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers gently stroking Emma's hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. "I knew this would happen. In a town like this, people can't imagine that a woman and man might have a relationship that isn't complicated. They can't believe that sometimes people just help each other because it's the right thing to do." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words feeling completely inadequate. "I never should have asked this of you." "You didn't ask," Sarah reminded him firmly. "I offered, because that baby was dying, and I had the means to help her. I'd make the same choice again, knowing what I know now." Despite her brave words, Thomas could see the cost this was taking on Sarah. She held herself differently, more defensively, as if preparing for attack. The easy warmth she'd shown yesterday had been replaced by a careful guardedness that broke his heart. "Maybe we should think of another solution," he said reluctantly. "I could try Denver again, see if there's a wet nurse willing to come up here." "That could take weeks," Sarah replied practically. "Emma can't wait weeks. She needs regular feeding now, every few hours until she's strong enough for other food." She paused, looking directly at him. "Besides, I won't be driven from doing what's right by small-minded gossip." Thomas admired her courage, but he could also see the vulnerability beneath it. Sarah Campbell was fighting not just for Emma's welfare, but for her own right to show compassion without being condemned for it. As if summoned by their conversation, a sharp knock echoed through the schoolhouse. Sarah's face went pale, and Thomas instinctively moved closer to her chair, some protective instinct kicking in, despite having no real claim to offer protection. "Miss Campbell." The voice belonged to Reverend Palmer, Silverbrook's self-appointed moral authority. "Might I have a word?" Sarah carefully adjusted her dress and handed Emma to Thomas before answering the door. Reverend Palmer stood on the threshold with two other men Thomas recognized as members of the school board, Henry Garrett, the bank president, and William Foster, who owned the largest mine in the area. "Gentlemen," Sarah said with cool politeness, "to what do I owe this visit?" "I think you know," Reverend Palmer replied, his gaze flicking past her to Thomas and the baby. "There have been concerns raised about your recent activities." "My recent activities have consisted of teaching children and helping a fellow human being in need," Sarah said calmly. "I'm not aware of any concerns that should arise from such work." "Miss Campbell," Henry Garrett spoke up, his tone patronizing in a way that made Thomas's jaw clench. "We understand you've been providing assistance to Mr. Mitchell and his child. While your compassion is admirable, the nature of that assistance has raised questions about propriety." "What questions?" Sarah's voice remained level, but Thomas could see her hands clenched at her sides. William Foster cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The intimate nature of the help you've been providing. It's simply not appropriate for an unmarried woman in your position." "The intimate nature?" Sarah's control finally cracked slightly. "I've been feeding a starving baby, If you find something inappropriate about preventing an infant's death, then I question your understanding of Christian charity. Now see here, Reverend Palmer bristled. No one is questioning your motives, but appearances matter. A single woman alone with a man, engaged in such personal care, it creates an impression that reflects poorly on both your character and this institution. Thomas had heard enough. Setting Emma carefully in her makeshift cradle, he stood and moved to Sarah's side. With respect, Reverend, he said, his voice carrying the barely controlled anger of a man pushed too far. Miss Campbell saved my daughter's life when everyone else in this town turned their backs. If you have a problem with that, your issue is with me, not her. Mr. Mitchell, Foster said dismissively, this doesn't concern you. This is a matter of Miss Campbell's employment and her conduct as a representative of our school. It concerns me plenty when you're questioning the character of the finest woman I've ever met. The words hung in the air, surprising everyone, including Thomas himself. But as he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, taking in her strength, her kindness, her willingness to sacrifice her reputation for a child she barely knew, he realized the truth of what he'd said. Furthermore, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger, if this town is so concerned about propriety, maybe the solution isn't to stop Miss Campbell from helping my daughter. Maybe the solution is to make the arrangement permanent and respectable. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Even Thomas was surprised by what he'd implied. But as the words settled, he realized they felt right in a way that nothing had felt right since Margaret's death. Are you suggesting, Reverend Palmer began, I'm suggesting that if the good people of Silverbrook are so concerned about appearances, they might consider the possibility that Miss Campbell and I could solve everyone's problems by making our arrangement formal. Thomas's heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. As man and wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at him with an expression he couldn't read, while the three men on the porch looked like they'd been struck by lightning. That's quite irregular, Foster stammered finally. What's irregular is condemning a woman for showing mercy, Thomas replied. What's irregular is letting a baby starve because helping her might cause talk. Miss Campbell has shown more Christian virtue in 2 days than this entire town has shown in months. Now see here, Palmer began angrily. No, you see here, Thomas cut him off. Miss Campbell will continue helping my daughter because Emma needs her. And if that troubles your delicate sensibilities, then maybe you should examine your own hearts and ask yourselves when preventing a child's death became something to condemn. After the men left, muttering among themselves about scandal and impropriety, Thomas and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Emma had slept through the entire confrontation, her peaceful breathing the only sound in the suddenly quiet schoolhouse. Did you mean what you said? Sarah asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had risked everything to save a stranger's child, who had stood up to social pressure with quiet dignity, who had shown him what real courage looked like. The answer came easier than he'd expected. I meant every word, he said quietly. If you'll have me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but Thomas couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or dismay. In the distance, Emma stirred, ready for her next feeding, blissfully unaware that her need for nourishment had just changed the course of 3 lives forever. The battle for their right to love and be loved was just beginning, but as Sarah reached for his daughter with steady hands and a heart full of courage, Thomas knew they would face whatever came next together. 3 days had passed since Thomas's impromptu proposal, and the tension in Silverbrook had thickened like mountain air before a storm. Word of the arrangement had spread beyond the mining town, drawing curious visitors and disapproving letters from church officials in Denver. Sarah had been suspended from her teaching position pending further review, and Thomas had been warned that his job at the mine was in jeopardy if he continued to cause disruption. But Emma was thriving. The baby who had been dying just a week before was now alert and gaining weight, her cries strong and healthy. For Thomas and Sarah, that was all that mattered, even as their world seemed to be crumbling around them. They had taken to meeting in the early morning hours at Sarah's small cabin behind the schoolhouse, when the town was still quiet and the gossips were still sleeping. It was during one of these dawn meetings that the past finally caught up with both of them. Emma had just finished nursing and was sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms when Thomas noticed the letter lying open on the kitchen table. The handwriting was feminine but unfamiliar, and the paper bore a Denver postmark from several days earlier. "Bad news?" he asked gently, noting the tension in Sarah's shoulders. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing Emma's soft hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with old pain. "It's from my sister Helen. She lives in Denver with her husband." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's heard about our situation. She wants me to come live with them until this scandal dies down." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I'm not going anywhere." Sarah's voice strengthened with conviction. "This is my home. These are my children I teach, or taught, and Emma needs me." Thomas felt something warm unfold in his chest at her words. The way she said "Emma needs me" with such maternal certainty made him realize that what had started as emergency help had become something deeper. Sarah wasn't just feeding his daughter, she was becoming her mother in all the ways that mattered. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Something I haven't told you about my son, about how he really died." Thomas remained silent, sensing that whatever she was about to share had been carried alone for too long. "Everyone thinks David died of fever, and he did eventually. But the fever came because—" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Because I couldn't feed him properly. My milk dried up when he was 3 months old. We tried everything: cow's milk, sugar water, even goat's milk when we could get it. But nothing worked. He grew weaker and weaker, and then the fever came, and he was too weak to fight it." The confession hung between them like a bridge built from shared grief. Thomas understood now why Sarah had been so desperate to help Emma, why she'd been willing to risk everything. She was trying to save the baby she couldn't save before. "It wasn't your fault," Thomas said quietly. "Wasn't it?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "A mother is supposed to be able to feed her child. It's the most basic thing, the most fundamental responsibility. And I failed." "No," Thomas said firmly, moving closer to her chair. "You did everything you could. Sometimes terrible things happen, despite our best efforts. That doesn't make them our fault." "How can you be so sure?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's peaceful face as she slept in Sarah's arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of his own buried grief. "Because I've spent the last 2 months blaming myself for Margaret's death, and I'm starting to understand that blame doesn't bring anyone back. It just eats you alive from the inside." Sarah looked up at him with surprise. In all their conversations, Thomas had mentioned his wife's death only in passing, never dwelling on the details or his feelings about it. "What happened to Margaret?" she asked gently. Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Silverbrook like ancient guardians. The sunrise was painting their peaks in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. "She wanted to give birth in Denver at a real hospital with real doctors. Said she didn't trust the mining camp midwives, wanted everything to be perfect for our first child." His voice grew rougher. "I should have insisted we stay in Silverbrook. Should have convinced her that Doc Peterson was good enough. But you didn't. Number wanted her to be happy, wanted her to feel safe. So we went to Denver, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. She labored for 2 days. The doctors tried everything, but Emma was turned wrong, and Margaret was small, and—" He stopped, unable to continue. "She died giving life," Sarah said softly. "There's no shame in that, Thomas. No blame to carry. I keep thinking if we'd stayed here, if I'd made different choices—" "Then you might have lost them both," Sarah finished. "At least this way, Emma survived. Margaret's last gift to the world was your daughter's life." Thomas turned back to her, and Sarah could see the weight he'd been carrying in the lines around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders as if prepared for another blow. "I haven't told you everything either," he continued, "about why people in town are so quick to think the worst of me." Sarah waited, understanding that confessions needed their own time and space. "I wasn't always a miner. Before I married Margaret, before I settled down, I had a different life. I was a soldier during the war, and after I saw what men could do to each other, I wasn't the same. I drifted for a while, took jobs that weren't always on the right side of the law. What kind of jobs? Security work, mostly, for mine owners who needed problems solved quickly and quietly. I never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, never robbed anyone who couldn't afford the loss, but he met her eyes directly. I wasn't a good man, Sarah. Not until Margaret showed me how to be better. Sarah absorbed this information without judgment, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. And now? Who are you now? I'm trying to be the man Margaret believed I could be. The father Emma deserves. The dot, dot, dot. He hesitated, then forged ahead. The husband you might be able to respect if you'll still have me after knowing the truth. Sarah stood carefully, settling Emma in her cradle before walking to where Thomas stood by the window. She reached out and took his hands, noting the calluses from honest work, the gentleness with which he always touched his daughter. I see who you are now, she said quietly. I see a man who carried a dying baby across dangerous territory to save her life. I see a father who would sacrifice his reputation and his job to ensure his daughter gets the care she needs. I see someone who protected my honor when I couldn't protect it myself. Sarah. I also see someone who's been carrying guilt that isn't his to bear, just like I have. She squeezed his hands gently. Maybe it's time we both stop punishing ourselves for things beyond our control. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the weight of shared understanding. Then Emma stirred in her cradle, letting out a small cry that broke the spell, but somehow made everything clearer. She's hungry again, Sarah said with a soft smile, moving toward the baby. Sarah, Thomas called, stopping her before she could pick up Emma. About my proposal the other day. I want you to know it wasn't just about stopping the gossip. I meant what I said about you being the finest woman I've ever met. Sarah turned back to him, Emma fussing in her arms. And I want you to know that when I said I wasn't going anywhere, I meant it, not because of what people expect, but because this feels right. Taking care of Emma, being here with you, it feels like healing. Even knowing what you know about my past, especially knowing what I know about your past, it shows me how far you've come, how much you've grown. The man you were doesn't matter. The man you are now is someone I could love. The admission surprised them both. Sarah blushed, but she didn't take the words back. Instead, she settled into her chair and began to nurse Emma. The domestic scene somehow charged with new meaning. Could love? Thomas asked quietly, moving closer. Am beginning to love, Sarah corrected, her eyes soft as she looked down at Emma. Both of you. Outside, Silverbrook was beginning to wake up. Soon the mines would whistle their call to work, the shops would open, and the gossips would begin their daily inventory of scandal and judgment. But inside Sarah's small cabin, three people who had found each other in desperation were building something new from the ashes of their individual griefs. Thomas knelt beside Sarah's chair, placing his hand gently over hers where it rested on Emma's back. Then marry me, he said quietly. Not because of what people say, but because I love you too. Because I want us to be a real family. Are you sure? Sarah asked, though her heart was already answering for her. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Sarah looked down at Emma, then back at Thomas, two lost souls who had found each other through their shared love for a child who needed them both. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was the life they had chosen. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Emma chose that moment to fall asleep at Sarah's breast, her tiny hand curled around Sarah's finger as if blessing their decision. And for the first time since David's death, Sarah felt the future stretching ahead, not with dread, but with hope. But their happiness would have to be fought for. As the sun climbed higher over Silverbrook, bringing with it another day of judgment and confrontation, Thomas and Sarah had no idea that their greatest test was yet to come. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Superintendent Harrison from the Territorial Education Board, a stern man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found little joy in life. He had ridden up from Denver specifically to investigate the moral situation in Silverbrook, bringing with him the authority to permanently dismiss Sarah from her position and blacklist her from teaching anywhere in Colorado Territory. Thomas was at the mine when word spread through town like wildfire. Harrison had taken one look at the school board's evidence, witnessed statements about Sarah nursing another woman's child, testimonies about improper conduct, and letters from concerned parents, and declared the situation an affront to Christian decency and educational standards. By the time Thomas heard the news and raced back to town, a crowd had gathered outside the schoolhouse. Parents who had once praised Sarah's dedication to their children now stood with arms crossed and faces set in judgment, while their youngsters peered out from behind their skirts, confused by the adult drama unfolding around their beloved teacher. Thomas pushed through the crowd to find Sarah standing on the schoolhouse steps, her back straight and her chin raised despite the tears he could see threatening to fall. Superintendent Harrison stood beside her, reading from an official document in a voice that carried clearly across the gathering. Therefore, by the authority vested in me by the Territorial Education Board, Miss Sarah Campbell is hereby dismissed from her position as school teacher of Silverbrook, effective immediately. Furthermore, she is banned from seeking employment in any educational capacity within Colorado territory, pending a full moral review. A murmur went through the crowd, some satisfied, others uncertain. Thomas noticed that not everyone looked pleased with this development. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house appeared troubled, and several of the minors he worked with seemed uncomfortable with the harshness of the judgment. "What exactly has Miss Campbell done that warrants such extreme action?" Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Harrison turned his cold gaze on Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume. Your involvement in this situation is well documented. Miss Campbell has engaged in conduct unbecoming of an educator, creating scandal and setting a poor example for the children in her care." "She saved my daughter's life," Thomas replied firmly, moving to stand beside Sarah on the steps. "If showing Christian mercy to a dying child is grounds for dismissal, then your education board has lost its moral compass." "The manner of assistance was inappropriate," Harrison replied coldly. "There are proper channels for such situations, proper institutions." "Which institutions?" Thomas's voice rose with anger. "Please, tell me which institution in a 50-mile radius would have helped a starving baby at 2 in the morning? Which proper channel should I have used while my daughter was dying?" Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Thomas pressed his advantage, his voice carrying the passion of a father defending his child and the woman who had saved her. "Miss Campbell asked for nothing in return. She risked her reputation, her career, everything she'd worked for, to keep an innocent baby alive. If that's not Christian virtue, then I don't understand what Christianity means anymore." "Mr. Mitchell," Reverend Palmer spoke up from the crowd, "no one questions Miss Campbell's motives, but the appearance of impropriety—" "The appearance of impropriety?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the square. "Reverend Palmer, when you preach about the Good Samaritan, do you add warnings about how his actions might appear to others? When you speak of Christ feeding the multitudes, do you caution against the scandal it might cause?" Her words hung in the air, and Thomas could see some faces in the crowd beginning to show doubt about their position. "This is quite different," Palmer began. "Is it?" Sarah's voice grew stronger. "A child was dying. I had the means to save her. I chose to act rather than let her die while considering the opinions of people who would rather preserve their sense of propriety than preserve a human life." "Miss Campbell," Harrison interrupted, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, "your dismissal stands. I suggest you gather your belongings and make arrangements to leave Silverbrook as soon as possible." "No." The word came from an unexpected source. Little Tommy Patterson, one of Sarah's students, who had broken free from his mother's grasp and run to Sarah's side. "Miss Campbell can't leave. She's the best teacher we ever had." "Tommy, come back here," Mrs. Patterson called, but her voice lacked conviction. "But Mama, Miss Campbell taught me to read, and she helped Billy with his arithmetic, and she always listens when we have problems." More children began to break away from their parents, gathering around Sarah like small guards protecting their beloved teacher. Thomas watched, his heart swelling, as Sarah knelt down to their level, despite the formal proceedings happening around her. "Children," she said gently, "sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions." "But it's not fair," cried little Susan Kowalski. "You didn't do anything wrong. You helped the baby." "She's right," came a voice from the back of the crowd. Tom Bradley, one of the younger miners, stepped forward. Miss Campbell's been nothing but good to this town. My little sister finally learned her letters thanks to her patience. Seems to me we're punishing virtue and calling it righteousness. This is not a debate, Harrison said firmly. The decision has been made. By who? Bradley challenged. By people in Denver who've never set foot in Silverbrook? Who don't know Miss Campbell or what she's done for our children? Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd. Thomas could see the tide of opinion starting to shift, and he seized the moment. Superintendent Harrison, he called out, if the Territorial Education Board is so concerned about moral standards, let me propose a solution that should satisfy everyone's sense of propriety. Harrison raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Miss Campbell and I are going to be married, Thomas announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. As soon as arrangements can be made, that should address any concerns about the nature of our relationship. Sarah looked at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. They had discussed marriage privately, but this public declaration was unexpected and bold. That changes nothing, Harrison replied dismissively. Miss Campbell's conduct occurred while she was unmarried, and the damage to her reputation cannot be undone by a hasty wedding. What damage? Mrs. Patterson suddenly spoke up, stepping forward from the crowd. Begging your pardon, Superintendent, but what damage are you talking about? Sarah Campbell is the finest woman in this town. She's educated our children, cared for our sick, and shown more Christian charity than the rest of us combined. Mrs. Patterson, Palmer began. No, Reverend, let me finish. Mrs. Patterson's voice grew stronger. I've lived in this territory for 15 years, and I've seen plenty of actual scandals. I've seen teachers who drank, who stole, who beat children. Sarah Campbell saved a baby's life. If that's scandal, then we need more scandals and fewer saints. She's right, called out Jim Morrison from the mining office. My boy couldn't write his own name before Miss Campbell worked with him. Now he's reading books. That's worth more than all your proper appearances. More voices joined in, and Thomas watched with amazement as the town began to rally around Sarah. The same people who had been whispering about impropriety just days before were now defending her character with passion. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson continued, if the Territorial Education Board wants to dismiss teachers for showing mercy, maybe we don't need the Territorial Education Board. Maybe we can find our own way to educate our children. Now see here, Harrison said, clearly flustered by the unexpected resistance. You cannot simply— Actually, we can, came a new voice. William Foster, the mine owner and school board member who had seemed so concerned about propriety just days before, stepped forward. I've been thinking about this situation, and Mrs. Patterson is right. We've been so worried about what Denver thinks that we forgot what we think. Thomas stared at Foster in shock. This was the same man who had threatened Sarah's position just 3 days earlier. My wife reminded me last night, Foster continued, about when our youngest had the fever 2 winters ago. Miss Campbell sat up with him for 3 nights straight, barely leaving his side until the crisis passed. She didn't worry about propriety then. She just cared about saving a child. How is this any different? The circumstances are entirely different, Harrison began. The circumstances are identical, Foster interrupted firmly. A child needed help, and Miss Campbell provided it. The only difference is some people have chosen to make something ugly out of something beautiful. Harrison's face was growing red with frustration. The Territorial Education Board has made its decision. Miss Campbell is dismissed, and that's final. Then maybe, Foster said quietly, Silverbrook needs to make its own decisions about education. We built this schoolhouse with our own money, we pay for supplies with our own funds, and we should be able to choose our own teacher. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Thomas felt Sarah's hand slip into his. He squeezed gently, amazed by the town's transformation from judgment to support. You cannot simply ignore territorial authority, Harrison sputtered. We're not ignoring anything, Foster replied calmly. We're exercising our right as a community to make our own choices. The Territorial Board can keep their authority over other schools. Silverbrook will take care of itself. As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopping to shake Sarah's hand or offer words of support, Thomas marveled at what had just happened. The same community that had seemed ready to cast them out had instead chosen to cast out the forces of judgment and narrow-mindedness. But their victory celebration was cut short by more bad news. Jake Morrison from the mine office approached Thomas with a grim expression. "Thomas, I need to tell you something," Jake said quietly. "Foster may be backing Miss Campbell, but the other mine owners aren't happy about the disruption. Word is they're planning to let you go. Make an example, so to speak." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Without his job at the mine, he had no way to support Emma or Sarah, no way to make a life in Silverbrook. "When?" he asked. "End of the week, most likely. They're bringing in a replacement from Denver." Sarah overheard and moved closer, her face pale but determined. "Then we'll find another way," she said firmly. "We'll make our own path." "How?" Thomas asked, the reality of their situation settling on him like a heavy blanket. "I don't have money saved, and you've just lost your teaching position?" "Actually," Foster interrupted, having overheard their conversation, "you haven't lost your teaching position, Miss Campbell. The community has decided to hire you directly. It won't be much money, but it'll be honest pay for honest work. And as for you, Thomas," Mrs. Patterson added, "the boarding house has needed a handyman for months. I can't pay much, but there's a room that comes with it, and it's honest work." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the unexpected support. These people who had seemed ready to shun them just days before were now offering them a lifeline. "But why?" Sarah asked softly. "Why are you helping us?" "Because," Mrs. Patterson said simply, "you helped us first. And because sometimes doing right is more important than looking proper." As the sun set over Silverbrook that evening, Thomas and Sarah sat on the schoolhouse steps with Emma sleeping peacefully between them. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the true character of their community and their own strength when they stood together. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked quietly. "Marriage, raising Emma together, building a life in a town that might always have people willing to judge us?" Sarah looked down at Emma, then at Thomas, her brown eyes clear and certain. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a wedding to plan, jobs to start, a future to build. But tonight, as the stars emerged over the Colorado mountains, three people who had found each other in desperation were finally truly safe." The wedding was set for the following Saturday, just 1 week after the confrontation with Superintendent Harrison. Sarah had wanted a simple ceremony, but the people of Silverbrook had other ideas. What began as a practical solution to gossip had become the town's way of celebrating their victory over narrow-minded judgment. Mrs. Patterson organized the women to prepare a feast, while the miners pooled their resources to buy Sarah a proper wedding dress from the catalog. Even Reverend Palmer, who had initially been part of the opposition, came forward to offer his services, admitting privately to Thomas that he'd been wrong to prioritize appearances over compassion. But not everyone in Silverbrook was happy with the turn of events. Henry Garrett, the bank president, remained firmly opposed to what he called rewarding improper behavior, and he'd been working behind the scenes to ensure that Thomas and Sarah's victory would be short-lived. The first sign of trouble came on Thursday morning when Sarah arrived at the schoolhouse to find the lock changed and a notice posted on the door. The message was brief and devastating. "By order of the Territorial Authority, this building is closed pending review of unauthorized educational activities." Thomas found Sarah standing on the schoolhouse steps, Emma in her arms, staring at the notice with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "They can't do this," he said, pulling the notice down and reading it quickly. "The community voted to support the school independently." "Apparently Garrett found a way around that," Sarah replied, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He owns the land the schoolhouse sits on. The community built the building, but they didn't buy the property." Thomas crumpled the notice in his fist. "So he's evicting the school to spite us." "It looks that way." They stood in silence for a moment, watching children arrive for their morning lessons, only to be turned away by the locked door. The confusion and disappointment on the young faces was heartbreaking. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. Sarah's expression suddenly brightened with determination. "We teach them anyway." "Where?" "Everywhere. In the town square, in people's homes, wherever we can gather children and books." She adjusted Emma in her arms, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "They can lock a building, but they can't lock up education." Word spread quickly through Silverbrook that school would continue, just in different locations. Mrs. Patterson offered her boarding house parlor for the younger children, while the older students would meet in the town hall that Foster had made available. Sarah divided her time between locations, teaching reading in the morning and arithmetic in the afternoon, with Emma often sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. The improvised arrangement worked better than anyone had expected. Parents who had rarely visited the traditional schoolhouse found themselves drawn into their children's education when it was happening in their own homes. Minors stopping by the boarding house for meals would end up helping with spelling lessons, and shopkeepers started keeping slate boards behind their counters for impromptu mathematics practice. But Henry Garrett wasn't finished with his campaign against them. On Friday evening, the day before the wedding, he played his final card. Thomas was at the mine, finishing his last shift before starting his new job with Mrs. Patterson, when the mine foreman approached him with a grim expression. "Mitchell, you need to see this," the foreman said, handing him an official-looking document. "Came in on today's stage." Thomas read the paper with growing dread. It was a warrant for his arrest, issued by a Denver court on charges of corruption of public morals and contributing to the delinquency of minors. The charges were vague but serious enough to carry jail time. "This is ridiculous," Thomas said, though his hands were shaking. "These charges don't even make sense." "Maybe not, but it's signed by a judge. Marshall's coming up from Denver to serve it tomorrow." Thomas felt the world spinning around him. Tomorrow was his wedding day, the beginning of the life he and Sarah were trying to build together. Instead, he might be arrested and taken away in chains. He rode back to town as fast as his horse could carry him, finding Sarah at her cabin preparing for their wedding. She took one look at his face and knew something was terribly wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting Emma in her cradle. Thomas showed her the warrant, watching her face pale as she read the charges. "Garrett's behind this," he said grimly. "He's found a way to get me out of the picture permanently." Sarah sank into a chair, the warrant trembling in her hands. "These charges, they could send you to prison. For years, probably. And they'll use my past against me. Paint me as a dangerous man who corrupted an innocent schoolteacher." They sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling around them like a suffocating blanket. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built, was about to be torn away by legal maneuvers and political connections. "You have to run," Sarah said finally. "What?" "Leave tonight. Take Emma and go somewhere they can't find you. Mexico, maybe, or California." Thomas stared at her in shock. "I'm not leaving you, and I'm not running away again. I spent years running from my past, and it never solved anything." "Thomas, they'll put you in prison. They'll take Emma away and give her to an orphanage. Is your pride worth more than her future?" "This isn't about pride," Thomas said firmly. "It's about doing what's right. If I run now, they win. Garrett and his friends get to destroy our school, drive you out of town, and prove that people like us don't deserve happiness. And if you stay, they'll destroy you. Maybe, or maybe the same community that stood up for us before will stand up for us again." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of love and exasperation. "You're gambling with our entire future." "I'm fighting for our future. There's a difference." Before Sarah could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas tensed, wondering if the marshal had arrived early, but Sarah opened the door to reveal William Foster and Mrs. Patterson, both looking grim. "We heard about the warrant," Foster said without preamble. "Garrett's been bragging about it at the saloon." "We came to help," Mrs. Patterson added. "This has gone too far." "I don't think there's much anyone can do," Thomas said heavily. "The law's the law." "Even when it's corrupt law?" Foster asked. "Thomas, I've been in business long enough to recognize a frame-up when I see one. These charges are garbage, manufactured by men who have more money than morals. Knowing that and proving it are two different things?" "Maybe," Foster replied. "But I've sent some telegrams to friends in Denver, men who owe me favors and have connections in the territorial government. I've asked them to look into who's really behind this warrant and what kind of pressure was used to get it issued." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. "And in the meantime, we're not letting them take you without a fight. Half the town is planning to be at your wedding tomorrow, warrant or no warrant. Let them try to arrest a man surrounded by people who believe in his innocence. Thomas felt a surge of emotion at their support, but also worry for their safety. I can't ask you to interfere with federal law enforcement. You're not asking, Foster said firmly. We're volunteering. This community decided to stand behind you and Sarah, and we meant it. Besides, Mrs. Patterson added with a slight smile, I've dealt with plenty of marshals over the years. Most of them are reasonable men who prefer to avoid unnecessary trouble. If they see that arresting you would cause a riot, they might be willing to listen to reason. After Foster and Mrs. Patterson left, Thomas and Sarah spent the evening making contingency plans while trying to hold on to hope. Emma slept peacefully, unaware that her father might be taken from her the next day. Whatever happens tomorrow, Sarah said as they prepared for bed, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life since David died. Sarah, let me finish. You and Emma have given me a purpose again, a reason to hope for the future. Even if they take you away, even if we never get our happy ending, I'm grateful for the time we've had. Thomas took her hands in his, looking into her brown eyes that had become so dear to him. They're not taking me away. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win. How can you be so certain? Because we have something Garrett and his friends don't understand. We have love worth fighting for, and a community that believes in us. That's stronger than money or political connections. As they went to their separate beds, propriety maintained even in crisis. Both Thomas and Sarah prayed that he was right. Tomorrow would bring either their wedding day or their greatest defeat, and only time would tell which force would prove stronger, the power of corruption or the strength of a community united in defense of what was right. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silent and eternal under a canopy of stars, witnesses to countless human struggles played out in their shadow. But tomorrow in the small mining town of Silverbrook, those mountains would witness something special. Ordinary people choosing to stand up for love, justice, and the belief that sometimes doing right was more important than being safe. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright over Silverbrook, the kind of perfect mountain day that seemed designed for new beginnings. But the beauty of the weather couldn't dispel the tension that gripped the town as word spread that Marshal Peters had arrived on the early stage from Denver, warrant in hand and determination on his weathered face. Thomas dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he'd worn to marry Margaret years before, now pressed and mended for a second chance at happiness. Emma gurgled contentedly in her basket, unaware that this day would determine whether she'd grow up with a father or as an orphan in territorial custody. Sarah prepared for her wedding with hands that trembled only slightly as she fastened the buttons on the white dress the women of Silverbrook had pooled their money to buy. It wasn't the wedding she dreamed of as a girl, surrounded by family and free from the shadow of scandal. But it was the wedding her heart wanted, joining her life to a man she'd come to love and a child who needed her. The ceremony was planned for noon in the town square, with Reverend Palmer officiating. But first, Thomas had to face whatever Marshal Peters intended to do about the warrant. The confrontation came at 11 o'clock, just as the wedding guests were beginning to gather. Thomas was adjusting his tie in Sarah's small mirror when the knock came. Firm, official, unmistakable. Mr. Thomas Mitchell? Marshal Peters was a tall, lean man with kind eyes that seemed at odds with his official duty. Behind him stood Henry Garrett, wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. That's me, Thomas replied, stepping outside with Sarah close behind him, Emma in her arms. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of corruption of public morals and contributing to the delinquency of minors. Will you come peacefully? Before Thomas could answer, the square began to fill with people. Not just wedding guests, but what appeared to be half the population of Silverbrook, all moving to surround the small group at Sarah's door. Thomas had never seen the town so unified, so determined. Marshal Peters, William Foster called out, pushing through the crowd. Before you execute that warrant, you might want to see this. Foster handed the marshal a telegram that had arrived on the same stage. Peters read it carefully, his expression growing thoughtful, then handed it to Thomas. The message was brief but devastating to Garrett's plans. Investigation reveals warrant obtained through falsified evidence and political pressure, charges being dropped immediately. Judge Morrison sends apologies for miscarriage of justice. It seems, Peters said slowly, that someone in Denver was overeager to please certain influential parties. The Territorial Attorney General has ordered all charges against you dropped, Mr. Mitchell. Garrett's face went white, then red with rage. This is outrageous. I demand— Mr. Garrett, Peters interrupted quietly, I'd be very careful about what you demand right now. Falsifying evidence to obtain a warrant is a federal crime. The only reason you're not in custody yourself is that the territorial government prefers to handle this quietly. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Thomas felt Sarah's hand slip into his, warm and steady, anchoring him to the moment and to the life they were about to begin together. However, Peters continued, there is the matter of your outstanding reputation in certain circles, Mr. Mitchell. The territorial government would prefer if you maintained a low profile going forward. I plan to do exactly that, Marshal. I'm getting married today and starting a new life as a handyman and family man. Nothing could be lower profile than that. Peters smiled slightly. Then I believe my business here is concluded. Congratulations on your wedding, sir. As the marshal departed and Garrett slunk away in defeat, the crowd's attention turned to the main event. Reverend Palmer stepped forward, his Bible in hand and a genuine smile on his face. Well, he said, his voice carrying across the square, I believe we have a wedding to conduct. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Sarah had no family present, and Thomas's relatives were scattered across the continent, but the people of Silverbrook had become their family. Mrs. Patterson served as matron of honor, while Foster stood as Thomas's best man. Emma, perfectly behaved for once, watched from Mrs. Morrison's arms as her father married the woman who had already become her mother in every way that mattered. Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take Sarah Campbell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Thomas said, his voice strong and certain. Do you, Sarah Campbell, take Thomas Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Sarah replied, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. By the power vested in me by God in the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle but passionate, sealing not just their marriage but their commitment to face whatever challenges the future might bring. When they broke apart, the crowd erupted in celebration that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The reception was held throughout the town, with food appearing from every kitchen and music provided by anyone who could play an instrument. The celebration continued well into the evening, a joyful affirmation of community solidarity and the triumph of love over adversity. As the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas and Sarah found themselves alone on the porch of their new home, the small house behind the boarding house that came with Thomas's job. Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, finally secure in the knowledge that she would never want for love or care again. No regrets? Thomas asked, echoing a question that had become meaningful between them. None, Sarah replied without hesitation. This isn't the life I plan, but it's the life I choose. Every day I choose it. Even knowing it won't always be easy, that people will sometimes still talk, still judge, especially knowing that. Some things are worth fighting for, Thomas. Love is worth fighting for. Family is worth fighting for. And what we have together, all three of us, is worth whatever challenges come our way. Thomas pulled her closer, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, I was a widower, drowning in grief, convinced I'd never love again. Now I'm married to the finest woman I've ever known, raising a daughter who will grow up knowing she's wanted and loved. A year ago, I was a broken woman convinced that I'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. Now I'm a wife and mother again, with a purpose that feels bigger than myself. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of Silverbrook settling into evening quiet. From inside the house came Emma's soft breathing, the gentle sound of an innocent child safe and secure in her family's love. What do you think she'll remember of all this? Sarah asked softly. Nothing specific, probably. But I hope she'll remember feeling loved and protected. I hope she'll grow up knowing that people can change, that families come in all forms, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. She'll remember that love conquered fear, Sarah said, that when people tried to separate us, we chose to stay together, that when they tried to shame us for showing compassion, we chose to be proud of our kindness instead. 5 years later, their hope proved prophetic. Emma Mitchell grew into a bright, confident child who knew beyond doubt that she was loved by both her father and the woman she called Mama Sarah. She had two younger siblings, David Thomas, named for Sarah's lost son and Thomas's middle name, and Margaret Rose, named for Thomas's first wife who had given them the gift of Emma's life. The Mitchell family had become a cornerstone of Silverbrook's community. Thomas's carpentry skills had made him one of the most sought-after craftsmen in the territory, while Sarah had built the region's finest school, attracting families from miles around who wanted their children educated by a teacher known throughout Colorado for her dedication and innovation. Henry Garrett had left Silverbrook shortly after the failed arrest attempt, his reputation ruined by the exposure of his corrupt tactics. The bank had been sold to more honest management, and the town had prospered under leadership that valued character over conformity. But perhaps the most important legacy of their struggle was what it taught the children of Silverbrook. Emma and her classmates grew up in a community that had learned to value compassion over convention, substance over appearance, and love over fear. They learned that families could be formed in many ways, that helping others was never wrong, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with kindness, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the mountains stood silhouetted against star-filled skies, Thomas and Sarah would sit on their porch and remember the desperate man who had climbed to a schoolhouse with a dying baby, and the woman who had opened her door and her heart without hesitation. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond Emma's physical survival, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the simplest act of human kindness. Their story became legend in Silverbrook and beyond, not as a tale of scandal overcome, but as proof that love really could conquer all, that families were built on choice as much as blood, and that the most beautiful beginnings often grew from the most difficult circumstances. What an incredible journey we've witnessed today, from a desperate father's plea to a love story that transformed an entire community. Thomas and Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful families are formed not by blood, but by the daily choice to love, protect, and cherish each other through whatever storms may come. Their tale proves that one act of compassion can change everything. When Sarah chose to feed baby Emma, she wasn't just saving a child's life. She was healing her own broken heart and creating a family that would bring joy to an entire town for generations to come. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's unexpected kindness completely changed your life? Or perhaps you've witnessed a family formed through choice rather than blood? We'd love to hear your stories of compassion, second chances, and the power of love to overcome even the harshest judgment. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Are you joining us from a bustling city or a small town like Silverbrook? Your stories of hope and healing inspire us to keep bringing you these powerful tales of human resilience. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our incredible stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Tomorrow we have another amazing tale that will remind you why kindness matters and why love really can conquer all. Until then, keep believing in the power of compassion to change the world, one heart at a time.